What if I told you that Ferrari left the Australian Grand Prix completely shocked? Not by the result of qualifying, but by what they discovered later in Lewis Hamilton's car. Because what seemed like just a discrete lap in qualifying actually hid something much more worrying inside the Ferrari. The data revealed a problem that completely changes the way the SF26 behaves when Hamilton tries to push it to its limits. And the most disturbing thing for the team is that this failure does not always appear. It appears just when you most need perfect performance. During the weekend in Albert Park, it seemed that Ferrari had enough pace to fight at the top. Even Hamilton managed to get quite close to his teammate Charles Leclerc's time in qualifying. But the final result left both cars far from where the team expected to be, something that did not fit with what they had seen during other phases of the weekend. And when the engineers began analyzing the data after the session, they realized something they didn't expect. The car could be competitive, but only within an extremely small window of operation. The moment something departed even slightly from that perfect zone of tire temperature, aerodynamic balance, or braking behavior, the Ferrari's performance dropped suddenly. That means Hamilton was driving a car that could be fast, but could also become unpredictable on exactly the most important lap of the entire weekend. Ferrari arrived at the Australian Grand Prix with a very dangerous mix of excitement, pressure, and expectations. Lewis Hamilton's debut with the Italian team had generated enormous media and sporting attention, because it was not simply another team change on the grid. It was about the 7-time world champion wearing red, in a project that sought to return Ferrari to the real fight for the championship after several seasons trying to rebuild its competitiveness. Within the team there was a feeling that this could be the beginning of a new era, one in which the experience of Hamilton and the consolidated talent of Charles Leclerc could form one of the strongest lineups in all of Formula One. From the first moment of the weekend in Albert Park, the objective was clear: to demonstrate that Ferrari had a car capable of fighting at the top of the grid. The Australian circuit is usually a special setting to measure the true potential of teams, because it combines fast corners, technical areas, and several opportunities to punish any weakness in the car's balance. In this context, Ferrari engineers had prepared an aggressive configuration to try to maximize the car's performance on a fast lap, something essential for qualifying. However, behind this ambitious plan there was also an important unknown. Hamilton was still in the process of adapting to the Ferrari. Although he had worked intensively with the engineers during the preseason and had accumulated kilometers and tests, the reality of a Grand Prix weekend is very different. Each circuit requires a particular driving style, and the Ferrari had very different aerodynamic and handling characteristics to the cars Hamilton had driven in recent years. During the first sessions of the weekend, the first signs began to appear that the adaptation would not be as simple as many expected. Hamilton was working hard to adjust his driving style to the behavior of the Ferrari, trying to replicate some of the habits Leclerc had developed with that car. In particular, he began to adopt a driving approach more similar to that of the Monegasque driver, releasing the accelerator earlier and using the brake differently to maintain a higher minimum speed in the corners. This type of adaptation is essential in Formula One, because small differences in the way of attacking a corner can mark several tenths in the lap time. Despite this learning process, Ferrari still saw reasons for optimism. At various stages of the weekend, the car's pace looked competitive, enough to think the team could fight near the front of the grid. The engineers were confident that, with some final setup adjustments and more confidence from Hamilton, the car could perform at the level they expected in the qualifying session. But at the same time, within the team they began to notice something strange in the behavior of the car. The Ferrari seemed to have an extremely delicate operating window. When everything was just right, the right tire temperature, the right aerodynamic balance, and the exact setup, the car was fast and competitive. However, when any of these factors deviated slightly, the car's performance dropped much more sharply than usual. That type of behavior can go unnoticed during training sessions, where teams have several laps to experiment and adjust settings. But it becomes a huge problem when it comes time to qualify, because at that moment the drivers have very few opportunities to execute the perfect lap. Any small variation in conditions can completely change the result. Ferrari knew that qualifying would be the decisive moment of the weekend. It was the opportunity to confirm whether the work done during the preseason and during the first sessions in Australia had really put the team in a position to fight for the top positions. Hamilton, for his part, arrived at that moment with the intention of showing that he could adapt quickly to the Ferrari and begin to build his own relationship with the car. And when that problem appeared, the impact within Ferrari was immediate. Because at that moment they began to realize that what was happening with Hamilton's car was not simply a matter of adaptation, but something that could seriously affect the performance of the car when they needed it most. Qualifying for the Australian Grand Prix was the moment Ferrari had been waiting for since the weekend began. After several intense work sessions, adjustments to the car's balance and many conversations between Hamilton and his engineers, everything was ready for the moment in which the SF20SIX's potential would really be measured. In Formula One, qualifying is a brutally demanding scenario. There are no real second chances, there is no room for mistakes, and each driver has to squeeze absolutely everything out of the car in just one perfect lap. For Ferrari, that moment represented the opportunity to show that the project with Hamilton was ready to fight against the best. When the session began, the atmosphere within the team was one of total concentration. The engineers followed each data carefully while the drivers went out on the track seeking to place the tires in the ideal temperature window. This detail is crucial in qualifying, because tires just a few degrees outside their optimal range can cause you to lose several tenths in a lap. Hamilton, aware of how important that first reference was, began to push from the first laps, trying to find the rhythm that would allow him to feel completely comfortable with the car. At that point, it seemed like everything was working out reasonably positively. Hamilton was posting competitive times and, most importantly for Ferrari, was relatively close to the pace of teammate Charles Leclerc. In fact, at times the difference between the two was just a few tenths, something that the team interpreted as an encouraging sign considering that the Briton was still adapting to his new car. But the real test came at the decisive moment, when all the drivers load the car with the minimum amount of fuel and use the most aggressive engine mode to try to extract the maximum possible performance. That is the moment in which every small detail of the car is exposed. And it was precisely there that something began to appear that Ferrari had not seen so clearly during the rest of the weekend. When Hamilton tried to push the car to its absolute limit to complete his fastest lap, the Ferrari's behavior changed unexpectedly. This was not an obvious error or a visible mechanical problem, but something much more difficult to identify in real time. The car seemed to lose stability at certain points of the lap, forcing the driver to correct small losses of control and slightly modify his way of attacking the corners. The true impact of what happened on qualifying for the Australian Grand Prix was not fully understood until Ferrari finished analyzing all the data from Hamilton's car. What initially seemed like a simple, complicated session began to transform into a much bigger concern within the team. Because when the engineers began to study the telemetry more calmly, they discovered that the Ferrari's behavior had not been an isolated case or a specific circumstance on the circuit. In reality, the car was showing a structural feature that could become a serious problem throughout the season. The data confirmed something that had only been a suspicion during the classification. The SF26 had an extremely small window of operation. That means the car could be fast, even very competitive at certain times, but only if all the variables were perfectly aligned. When the tire temperature, aerodynamic balance, and car loading were kept within that ideal range, the Ferrari responded exactly as the drivers needed. But when any of those factors changed even minimally, performance dropped sharply. That kind of behavior is one of the biggest fears for any Formula One team. A car with such a narrow performance window can look competitive at times during the weekend, but become extremely difficult to drive when the most important moment arrives. And that was precisely what happened with Hamilton in qualifying in Australia. The British driver was trying to push hard to get his best lap, but the Ferrari began to behave less predictably just as he was pushing the car to the limit. For a driver like Hamilton, whose speed has always been closely linked to absolute confidence in the car's behavior, that kind of inconsistency can make a huge difference. When a driver is not completely sure how the car will react when braking or entering a fast corner, he inevitably loses a few tenths in each sector. And in a qualifying session where differences are measured in milliseconds, those small losses add up quickly. Within Ferrari, this situation generated a mix of concern and urgency. Because the problem not only affected an isolated fast lap, but could also have consequences on the development of the car for the rest of the season. If the car was dependent on extremely specific conditions to perform at its best, then each circuit on the calendar could present a completely different challenge. In some Grand Prix, the Ferrari could be competitive, while in others it could suffer unexpectedly. The Australian Grand Prix classification left much more than an unexpected starting grid for Ferrari. What seemed like just a complicated session ended up revealing something much deeper within the Italian team. The subsequent analysis showed that the real problem had not been a bad lap by Lewis Hamilton nor a simple question of adaptation to the new car. What Ferrari discovered was that the car's behavior was much more delicate than they had imagined before starting the season. The SF26 demonstrated the potential to be competitive, but also made clear that its performance depends on an extremely narrow operating window. When everything is right, the car can get close to the best times and fight at the top of the grid. But when any of these factors change slightly, be it tire temperature, aerodynamic balance, or circuit conditions, performance can suddenly disappear. And that was precisely what happened at the most important moment of the weekend in Melbourne. Leave me in the comments what you think of all this.